Hey everybody, today I wanted to talk about learning other systems other than D&D and more specifically what D&D incentivizes, also known as the murder hobo problem. So specifically I've been learning Blades in the Dark recently. I've made a couple of TikToks and shorts about it. It's a really cool system and I have a feeling I'm going to be playing it a lot in the future because it does a lot of things that I've always kind of wanted out of D&D and that I've never known how to do. And it makes a couple of modifications to the core formula that this doesn't have. And one of those modifications made me realize the things that D&D incentivizes. And while I was thinking about all that, I saw a TikTok about murder hobos in D&D and how to work around it, how to solve it. And I kind of realized that the two things were linked. You can't really solve murder hoboing in D&D without working around D&D itself. So to kind of break that down, I want to separate the problem, the hobo and the murder. So for the first part, there's an implicit assumption in Dungeons and Dragons of dungeons. And I know that's kind of weird to think about. That sort of feels like, well, yeah, there are contained areas where you go in and do things. But it wasn't until I started reading this that I really realized the sort of way that this assumption is baked in. In Dungeons and Dragons, it is expected that you will go and you will find a place where there are enemies and you will work your way through the place and you will clear it out. Like, that is just how the game is set up. To be more specific, in Blades in the Dark, there is a concept called heat. And it is essentially how much suspicion your activities are drawing. There is no concept of your actions drawing suspicion in Dungeons and Dragons, at least at base. So the assumption is that while you're doing these things, while you're doing combat, while you're doing exploration, that these activities are not drawing any sort of unwanted attention, or that the attention that they're drawing is not hostile in nature. There's no trouble with the law. So this leads to this overarching narrative of the dungeon as this place separate from society, separate from the law, that you go there, you do your stuff, and then you return. They're kind of one and done type activities. Again, unless you create some sort of extra features. Sure, you can create a dungeon that respawns monsters, respawns loot, and so you don't have to go and find new ones, but that's not at base. There are no actual systems to do that in this book. So the assumption is that you're going to have a dungeon, you're going to clear it out, there's not going to be any repercussions because it's this separate area, so it's not like in a town, you're not going against a faction. There's a there's a dungeon with monsters, you go in and clear it, and then you move on to the next one. And that was the initial connection. You might recognize that point from a TikTok where I sort of realized, like, oh, that's the murder hobo problem, is you clear out the dungeon and then you go on. It's different than running like a political career, running a crew of thieves. Like, this is quintessentially pushing you to different areas. And that's just built into the assumptions of the system. Yes, you can get around it, but the system is not built that way, at least at base. And it's also built to where most dungeons are kind of assumed to only take you 1 or 2 sessions. It's not set up where, like, the system itself does not set it up to where a one dungeon is supposed to take the entire campaign. So you move around. There's also what is built into the traveling aspect of D&D is also kind of implicit in this hobo-like nature. If you think about traveling is not necessarily kind of this hobo problem where you're moving from place to place. You can have a game that is about travel. You could have one that mirrors something like The Lord of the Rings, where the entire thing is all about travel and you could work in systems around that. D&D does not. The exploration pillar in D&D is criminally underdeveloped. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially you just have montages normally. There's not a lot really going on as far as exploration goes. The only way that it really goes into exploration is when talking about travel pace. So it's essentially talking about, resource management. There's very little about the random encounters that you might experience along the way. There's very little about, interacting with hazards, the environment. There are some things like falling and suffocating, but those are, zoomed in things. But the activities while marching, there is marching order, noticing threats, and other. And it takes up less than a page. So just think about that. In this system, there's less than a page really dedicated to the things that happen while you travel. So the real nature of it is you're not supposed to spend a ton of time, in-game time, on that travel. You are supposed to do what you're doing and then move to the next place really quick. There's not like a caravan sequence. There aren't things that you run into while you travel. At base, you do your thing, you do a quick montage of resource management and whatever, and then you're at the next place. So you don't spend a lot of time traveling, so you have to travel to a lot of different places. Because you're clearing the dungeon, travel. Clear the dungeon, travel. And so 3 dungeons is normally going to take like 3 sessions. There's not a ton of time spent traveling where it's like, okay, maybe 1 dungeon and then, 3 sessions of travel and then next. At least, again, all of this is at base. Yes, you can spend a lot of time in-game on travel, but that's not what the system implicitly recommends. The next thing that I really noticed in Blades in the Dark, which was almost a shock to me, is that they give you so much information about settlements, they give you maps, they give you district information, they give you NPCs, they give you freaking newspapers, restaurants, establishments, like detailed things about all of these places. And I was like, dang, D&D doesn't do any of that, especially not in the player's handbook. In the DMG, there's like a couple. Like there are these maps, but they are, I don't want to call them bare bones. They're nice maps, but there's like 4 pages of them in an entire book for dungeon masters. All this book does really is just go over how to create all of your own things, a world of your own, creating a multiverse, creating adventures, creating non-player characters, adventuring environments. This is great. I'm not saying that this is bad at all. But it was really, really apparent to me that you are supposed to create your own stuff in D&D, which again is fine, but it enforces the hobo problem. If I am running a campaign in D&D and I am creating everything from scratch, as the system clearly wants me to, it's not going to be in depth. I'm not a professional writer. Unless I take months, if not years, to design something like this, it's not going to be super in depth, not nearly as in depth as just one of the cities, as Duskwall in Blades in the Dark. It's not going to be anywhere near that detailed. And so, players are going to pick up on that. They're going to realize that they've exhausted the stuff in this settlement, and they're going to move on. Especially going back to the dungeon aspect. Even if I do create a super detailed situation, super detailed city, they are going to have to go other places to get new dungeons. And if I, as the DM, have put all of my time into that single city, I can't put a ton of time into these other one-and-done locations that they'll never go back to because they've defeated the dungeon. So it really creates this really wide area of effort on the part of the dungeon master. Or you buy modules and use that stuff. But that's more money. I'm kind of talking about the base system. One book, maybe two. And that's another thing just to highlight is that, you need 2 books to get a fraction of the detail that you get in this one. But I digress. Next, let's talk about the murder, because I feel like I've pretty well established why the hobo occurs. The murder occurs because that's what the devs put their time into. It's a pretty well-trod path that D&D is a very combat-heavy system, but you really don't realize it until you experience a system that really is not. I mean, combat is a core part of Blades in the Dark, but it doesn't get nearly the depth that it gets in Dungeons and Dragons. We can talk about, the entire chapter in the PHB that's dedicated to it, but something that someone brought up to me while I was talking about this, I thought was really insightful. It's the Monster Manual. I mean, this is considered one of the 3 core books in D&D 5e, and it is mainly a collection of stat blocks. Yes, there is some lore in there, but it's mostly used as descriptive filler. I mean, just consider the demons' stat blocks, right? Oh, look at all that lore. No stat blocks in sight. Well, this is for an entire collection of demons, and each demon itself gets a tiny little blurb. Gets 2 paragraphs, whereas every single one of them gets huge stat blocks. I mean, the stat blocks take up so much more space than the lore does. And even considering, not even considering the length or quantity of lore, but considering the quality, let's think about if exploration was weighted equally to combat in 5e. You would need tracking information about every single monster in here. Because what if I don't want to fight them? What if I want to track them down? What if I want to catch them? I need to know their dietary habits, their the evidence that they lead for tracking, their natural predators, their natural prey, rituals to summon them if they're, demons or fiends. I mean, all of this would be core information that could be used for an exploration pillar. But instead, we get stat blocks about how they behave in combat and the things that they do in combat. And that is really, really sort of obvious and damning as to why D&D is such a combat-heavy system. The other thing that is, I would say maybe more minor, but is still something that should be brought up, is that most of the classes give you abilities that are primarily used in combat. If we think about something like the fighter's multi-attack, the fighter's multi-attack is only useful in combat. Literally, there is no outside combat application for multi-attack. Yes, you can theoretically exhaust your brain thinking about, that means that the fighter can attack every 3 seconds instead of every 6 seconds, so that might have some sort of weird niche out of combat utility. It doesn't. Don't trick yourself. There are so few non-combat related abilities. There are abilities that have only non-combat utility. The only ones that I can really think of are things like expertise, right? But that is so generalized. It's not even targeting a specific pillar. It's targeting both social and exploration, because all of those pillars, or both of those pillars, are all taken care of through the skill checks. So you're not even getting an exploration only thing or a social only thing. The only things like that are the Bard subclass's Silvery Tongue, the College of Eloquence. But that is it's not a niche ability, it's very strong. But it's only one ability on one subclass, whereas every subclass and every class has to have combat utility. They have to. Otherwise, they don't get played. Like, every single rogue subclass gives you some sort of interaction with your sneak attack. Almost everyone. I believe the only one may be Arcane Trickster or Thief. That doesn't, but they give you other things. Like, Thief gives you things that you can do with your Cunning action, which is a combat utility. So, my entire point here is that all of these things are reinforcing the combat pillar. And when you get so many things that reinforce the combat pillar, you're going to want to use it. This is not saying that you can only solve problems with combat in 5e, or that combat is the only viable way to solve problems in 5e. What I am saying is, if you repeatedly get tools, if the game repeatedly gives you tools that are fun and bright and shiny and new, you're going to want to use them. And if all of those tools are mostly related to combat, you're gonna want to do combat so that you can use them. If I'm a fighter and I get a 4th multi-attack, I don't want to talk my way out of a situation. I want to attack 4 times, because attacking 4 times is fun. Compare this to Blades in the Dark advancement, which gives you new things for your settlement, or new abilities that are rarely combat specific. They are normally much more generalized and can be used in a wide variety of situations. And finally, what I would consider the smoking gun is that by default, XP is used for leveling, and by default, the only guidance on how to gain XP is through combat. Every single monster has an XP value on how much it gives you if you take it out in combat. However, the only guidance that the PHB gives for out of combat experience is give it whenever the DM feels it's appropriate. That's it. I mean, it's crazy. It is crazy that this is, I mean, it's so clear and so obvious. You could even, and I'll give you an example of how they could have done this alternatively. If you say, hey, you can give them 100 experience when they pass a social encounter that had a minimum DC of 13. You give them 100 experience every time they do that, right? But that wouldn't be as fun because a social encounter is just like one roll of the dice. So that's not interesting, but that just goes to show that the social pillar really isn't that interesting. So a lot of people either do XP and just do combat because D&D is a combat-focused RPG, or they do milestone leveling and you just level up whenever the DM tells you to. But I should not spill any more ink on how the system encourages combat. You've probably heard it all already. So all of this leads to gameplay and a gameplay lifestyle that is primarily traveling very quickly and murdering. Hence, the murder hobo. That's it. That's all I got. It's not a groundbreaking discovery. It's not a groundbreaking piece of analysis, but I think that it is instructive in showing people that maybe assumptions about their players or about the game or about TTRPGs in general might be more informed by the situation you're in rather than people's innate desires. I don't think very many people are murder hoboing in Blades in the Dark. The system doesn't support it. You get heat. It's really hard. There's a system of turf, so only certain parts of the city are controlled by you. I mean, this system does not encourage murder hoboing, and so people don't do it. Whereas this system does, and there's memes aplenty about it. So maybe think about that the next time you're trying to solve a problem or you're complaining about your character's behavior or the player's behavior. Think about the systems that might be reinforcing said behavior. And, I mean, it's not a bad lesson to take into life in general, but I don't know. For now, probably just focus on D&D. Thanks, everybody.